Welcome back. And this is going to be the last part of this project. So we're almost done here. Now, for security reasons, real bank applications will log out users after some inactive time. For example, after 5 minutes without doing anything. And that's what we will implement in this video using the setInterval timer. And let's start with one final look at our flowchart. So the timer appears in multiple places here, and the first one is right here. So whenever the user logs in, the logout timer will start or restart. All right. And then as soon as the logout timer expires, which will be after like 5 or 10 minutes, then we want to log the user out. All right. So basically that's what we will do with the timer, but let's start very simple. So the place where we want the timer is here in this function about the login. Okay, so this here is the handler function that handles the login, and so our timer will start here. Now we already have plenty of code here, as you see, right? And therefore, let's actually create a separate function which will start this logout timer. All right. So let's say start logout timer. And this function doesn't need any arguments. All it does is to basically export some functionality into an external function. So let's write some pseudocode here, basically by writing some comments to say what exactly we are going to do here. So we will start by setting the time to, let's say, 5 minutes. Okay. Then we want to call the timer every second. Then in each call, so in each callback call, print the remaining time to the user interface. And then when the time is at 0, so after the timer basically expired, so when we reach 0 seconds, stop timer and log out user. Okay. And to make this a bit easier to visualize, let's go again here to our demo application. And so the timer that I mean is this one here, which actually starts at 10 minutes. And you see that after each second, a new time is basically printed here. All right. And I'm not going to wait for 10 minutes now, but when this reaches 0, then the user will, of course, be logged out. Okay. So let's basically do everything that we described here. So I'm setting the time for now just to 10 seconds. Okay, just so we see what's going on. Or actually, let's say 100 seconds, so that we have actually more than 1 minute. Then we want to call the timer every second. So basically what this means is to use the setInterval function and then pass in a callback function, and this callback will be executed every second. And so 1000 milliseconds here. All right. Then each time that this function is called, print the remaining time to the user interface. And then this one here as well. So when we're at 0 seconds, stop the timer and log the user out. So we want to print the time here to this label, which is called label timer. So let me just show it to you here in our elements that I pre-selected. So label timer is the element with the selector of simply timer. Okay. So let's go. So label timer dot text content is equal to the time. And so that's this here. So I forgot to write the name of the variable actually. And now to make this actually work, we also need to remove 1 second in each of these function calls, right? So decrease 1 second. And so time equal time minus 1, which is essentially the same as saying time minus minus. All right. So this is the logic of this timer. We start with a certain number of seconds. Right now that's 100. And then each time that this callback function here is called, we remove 1 second from that. Okay. And so this is called every second. And so basically we will end up with a timer which shows the current number of seconds each second. Okay. And now all we need to do is to then call this function here on login. So, well, let's do that here before updating the UI. So start, logout timer. And now let's quickly log in here. And indeed, you see this number here decreasing now. Okay, so hopefully that that logic makes sense of decreasing 1 second every second. Now, where is that? We have too many functions here, I guess. Now, here we go. So again, the logic here is to decrease the timer by 1 second every second. And so therefore, we get this number here going down by exactly 1 each second. All right. Now, we don't really want to see only the seconds. We want to see the minutes as well. So basically, we need to convert this simple number of seconds to minutes and seconds. All right. So let's do that here as well. So let's say the minutes is the current time divided by 60. So that's the easiest way, basically, of writing it. So it's not going to be correct, but it's going to show us what we need to do next. Now here we're also seeing already what happens with this timer after a certain number of seconds. So indeed, as soon as the time hits 0, it will not simply stop, right? We're not telling the timer anywhere to stop. And so it will simply continue and become negative. And so that's what we will have to implement then down here. But let's leave that for later. For now, we just want to display the number here in minutes and seconds. But for now, I will just show you the minutes, just to show you what we need to do next. So you see that we have 1 minute, 0.6 or 0.5 something. So it's decreasing every second, but this number here after the comma or after this period doesn't really make sense, right? So basically what we want to do is to take whatever remains of dividing the time by 60, because that will be our seconds. So let me show that to you as well. So seconds will be the remainder of dividing time by 60. And so that's where, again, the reminder function is very helpful. So the reminder operator, actually. So let's now print both of them here as a template literal. So minutes, and then colon the second. Okay, and this is still far from being complete, but let's take it step by step here. So you see that this number here is now decreasing very nicely. And it started at 1 minute and 40 seconds. And that's exactly what 40 seconds is, right? So let's do this again, actually. And notice down there how it starts exactly at 1:40. So you saw that? And that 40 appeared because that is the reminder of dividing 100 by 60. So let's see it here in the console. So when we divide 100 by 60, then this is the result. But if we do 100, the remainder, then we get 40. All right? And that's because 1 times 60 plus 40 is then again 100. All right? Now here we actually do not want then this value after the comma, right? We are only interested in basically the integer. And so let's cut off that decimal part by saying math.trunc, all of this here. And then we also want to pad this number here with a 0. So for example, right now we are at 8 seconds or -8, but we want to see 0.8, just like in a normal clock. Okay, and for that we can again use the pad function. So let's convert this here to a string so that we can then call pad start, which should have the length of 2, and pad it with 0, or just the number is okay, and then the same here. And so now we should get a nice looking clock already. Let's actually start at 120 seconds, which is exactly 2 minutes. So you see now it's a nicely looking and nicely working clock, basically. So a countdown timer that starts counting from 120 seconds, which is exactly 2 minutes. And so that's why in the beginning the seconds is 0, because the remainder of doing 120 by 60 is 0, because 2 times 60 is exactly 120. Right? So 2 times 60 is 120, and therefore there is no remainder. So there are no seconds in our case. Okay? But let's not do it with only 10 seconds, because then we get that negative, and we can then work with that. So what we want to do here is as soon as we reach 0 seconds, we want to stop the timer and log out the user. So if the time is 0, then we need to stop the timer. And we do that by using clear interval. So remember in the last video, we used clear timeout to stop the set timeout function. And now we can use clear interval to do the same with the set interval timer. All right. Now, in order to make this work, remember, we need to give a name to this timer. So let's simply call it timer. And then here we can use that variable to indeed stop that timer. And then we want to log out the user, which basically means setting the opacity of this whole container here back to 0. So here in our login, we did the opposite. So we set the opacity to 100, and now logging out the user basically means setting it back to 0. And here this text content should also be set to something else, so not the name of the current user. So let's copy that. And so here the welcome label should say login to get started, which is basically also the default that we see right now, right? And then the opacity back to 0. And remember that usually when we first see the application, all of this is actually invisible. And let's do that here, actually. So get rid of this fake always logged in. So we did that before to test our code, but now it's no longer necessary. And so this is how the application is supposed to look like in the beginning. So we logged in, and now our timer down here is running. And so let's just see what happens once it reaches 0. And indeed, we got logged out here. Okay, so that works beautifully. But let me log in again here so I can show you something that happens and that we need to fix. So as I log in, it takes quite some time until something happens here. Maybe you didn't catch that, so let me try it again after we get logged out here. So I will scroll down immediately and then I hit enter. So you see, before it was still at 1 second. So it was the value that we had before. And that happened because this entire function here is only first executed after 1 second, right? So this callback function that we passed into setInterval is not called immediately. It will only get called the first time after 1 second. But in fact, we want to call this function also immediately, all right? And so the trick to doing that is to export this into a separate function, then call it immediately, and then also start calling it every second using the setInterval function. So let me just show it to you. So I cut the function here. Let's put it here. So we need to give it a name. I'm calling it tick because that's a pretty common name. And now I put it here. And so right now everything is exactly the same as before. But what I wanted to do is to also call this immediately. And so this is how we do it. And so now right away this function gets called, and then after that every 1 second. And so let's try it now again. Let me scroll down here. And you see, this time we didn't have that problem. Now it's simply not counting down, but that's because I did this small mistake here, which you see is very common in development. You will do this also all the time. And well, now we didn't see at the beginning of the timer, but believe me, now it's actually working correctly. However, you might have noticed that we still have a problem, which is the fact that actually we get logged out once this hits 1 second. And so watch closely now what happens when we reach 1. You saw that? And so that's not what we want to happen. This should only happen at 0 seconds, not at 1 second. And the problem here is that we decrease this time by 1 second before checking for 0. So basically the problem here is that in the iteration here, so in the call where the time is 1, right? So here it's going to be 1, and then we decrease to 0, and then we check for 0. And so in this iteration where the time is initially 1, this part of the code still gets executed. And again, because we increase that 1 second to 0 here before this. And so we need to put it after, of course. And so now this part of the code here only gets triggered if the time really is 0 here in this whole function. So now you will see that the logout will only really happen after exactly 10 seconds. So you saw it reached 0, 0, and then we got logged out. Great. So let's increase this here a little bit. And then I will log in as this user. So you see that it's running. And now I will also log in as Jessica Davis, just to see you yet another problem that we have. So you see, it's weirdly alternating between these two numbers. And the reason for that is that right now we have basically 2 timers running at the same time. So 1 timer of Jonas and 1 timer of Jessica. And so that's not at all what we need, right? That's a big problem right now. So how can we fix this problem? Well, basically what we can do is that whenever we log a user in, we check if there is already a timer running, and if so, then we stop that timer. So I believe that is the best solution to this problem. And so what I'm going to do now is to return the timer from this function so that we can then use it here in this callback function of the login and delete it in case that it exists. So let me write that code actually, and then it's going to become a lot easier to understand. So here we will return the timer. And that's important because to clear the timer, so to use the clear interval function, we need the timer variable. And so therefore I'm returning it here. So let's then save it here. So that's down here. And so this is going to be the timer. Now we actually need this as a global variable. So let me put that outside here. So the current account and the timer. And the reason for that is that we need this variable to persist between different logins. So otherwise, after this handler function here would be ready, then the timer variable would disappear. So that's the reason why we have current account out here, and it's also the reason why we need to keep the timer out here. That's the only way in which we can then actually check if it appears. So timer and current account both need to be in the parent scope of this function scope. So let me show you what I mean. So here I will then set the timer to the timer that is returned here. However, if there already is a timer, I first need to clear it. And so let's do that. So if there is already a timer, then clear interval timer. And that's it. So let's think what happens when I log in first as Jonas. So when I log in now, there's going to be no timer, right? So in this situation, there was no timer already, was it? There wasn't, because I just logged out for the first time, and so no timer variable was created. But now, since I did log in, now timer is equal to that timer that I just exported from this function using the return keyword. And so this timer now does exist. And so when I now log in as someone else, so Jessica Davis, for example, then when the code reaches this line here, then a timer will indeed exist. And so then that timer is going to be cleared. Okay. And so now there is no problem anymore. Okay, so now it's running smoothly without any problem. And that, of course, also works when the timer here has a higher value. Let's put it back to 2 minutes. So I can now log in. The timer starts running normally. And when I log in then as Jessica, then the timer gets cleared and resetted basically, and it started again from 2 minutes. Okay. So all this might seem a little bit complicated, I know, but it's all kind of a matter of thinking about what we want our code to do. So all we're doing here is to use all the tools that we already know to basically achieve one goal that we want to achieve, which is in this case, this timer here running and being resetted each time that another user logs in. Now, another functionality that we want our timers to have is to basically reset once we do something in the account. Because remember, the goal of this timer here is to track the inactivity of the user. So the time where the user doesn't do anything. But if I do something, let's say transfer money, then we should not get logged out. It should be resetted. But as you saw, we still got logged out even after doing that transfer, of course. So what we need to do now is to also reset the timer whenever the user does a transfer or requests a loan. So these are the only two activities that exist in our application. And so these operations should always trigger the timer to be reset. Okay? So let's go here to the transfer. And let's do it here at the end. Reset the timer. So what does resetting the timer actually mean? Well, all we need to do is to basically clear interval using the timer that we already have, and then start it again. So clear interval, and then the timer variable. And so now one more time, it is important that this timer variable is actually a global variable. So a variable that's outside of any of these handler functions. So we define timer, remember, out here, because we didn't want it to be inside of this handler function here. And that was because we wanted this variable to persist throughout multiple logins. But now it's also important because we need it later for other operations. So inside other callback functions. And in particular in this one now. So clear interval of that timer that was defined previously, and then we simply start a new one. So basically we then overwrite that initial timer that we had before. So start, logout timer, and that's actually it. So imagine that the timer was at 1 minute 30 seconds. So when we do a transfer, that timer is cleared and a new timer is started again at 2 minutes. Okay, and now finally the same for requesting a loan. So let's try that. And now the timer is running down here. All right, and now let's try to transfer something to JD, so the other user, let's say 100. And watch what happens down here to the timer now. And indeed, it got resetted to 2 minutes. And the same when we request a loan, let's say 100. And then after the 3 seconds have passed, then our loan got approved indeed, and our timer reset to 2 minutes. Beautiful. Great. So our application is now actually finished and feature complete. Everything is working just as in our demonstration, and I think this was a great application to teach you really a lot of different stuff in JavaScript. So huge congratulations for finishing this great application. It's good to see that you made it to this point with me, and I hope that you're really proud of this application that you just built. You can now show it to all your friends and everyone that you're telling about your coding journey, and I'm sure they will be just as happy as you are about this amazing progress. So once more, great job and well done. And with that being said, I hope to see you soon in the next section where we're going to build together some features of a real website. So UI components that you find commonly in normal websites, such as sliders or pop-up windows. So that's going to be really exciting. So I hope to see you there soon.